But you look around and go like, there are legitimately dozens and dozens of real estate sponsors that have huge portfolios that have gone bankrupt and shut down. And so in Canada, there's some structural problems we can get into later that I think it's more about like clearing the indigestion that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
But I look around and, I flew into Pearson today and all I saw was just like, single family homes everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's plenty of opportunity to just build tons and tons of housing here.
Yeah. It doesn't appear so easy.
Especially even there's a housing crisis.
50 reasons. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's fun. If you look at the US, there's like in the top 50 MSAs, you can argue maybe like 2/3 of them are in housing crises. So what typically happens with a housing crisis in the US is either you stay or if you can't find somewhere to live, you just move to another city.
Right.
Whereas Canada, you've got Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, probably Winnipeg somewhere in there.
Ish.
Do I want to go from Toronto to Winnipeg? Sorry, Winnipeg. Like it's really cold there.
The only way you could get the same lifestyle is go Toronto, Vancouver, and that doesn't solve anything.
No.
So you don't have a substitute effect. And so like you have this like hyper concentrated megapolis, which is I think 5 million people spread across, a pretty large area. And so I really boil it down to you guys have like that kind of British planning system.
Yeah.
With like the Planning Act of 1950 and the fact that like you've got these green belts and you have the whole community basically giving you input, like if you want to renovate your backyard or something.
Yeah.
Which is wild. So
yep.
Canada.
That's not the case in the States.
It's state by state. So
right.
You go to a place like Texas, you do what you will, right? There's code. But if you go to like California or like a small township in like New Jersey, it's like Canada. It's like you can't do anything
right
without approval. And so
how do you think about what in terms of like what the big players are going through, whether it's on the development side, multifamily, industrial, retail, name any asset class, like what are the major issues that they're dealing with right now and kind of where do you see the market going over the next year or so?
I mean, in Canada, like my perspective is there's this huge capital market structure problem. And what I mean by that is your actual capital stack, your debt. Like, hey, you were able to borrow for 2 to 3% for a very long time when interest rates were 0. And if you go to the market now, I don't know what the rates are, but they're not 2%. Like, let's say they're 5, 6, 7, maybe 9% for some people.
Mm-hmm.
You go from paying $100 and all of a sudden you have to pay $300 in debt service. You have to solve that problem.
Right.
The one thing that I appreciate about the US is we have this thing called bankruptcy and non-recourse financing. So, if this asset won't work.
That's the biggest one, non-recourse financing.
You just walk away.
Yeah.
And say, like, here are the keys. I'm going to lose a boatload of my money and my investors' money. And you get a clean start. So here, everything's guaranteed personally.
Yeah.
So you don't get that clean slate.
Does nobody have relationships enough where they don't have to guarantee it in that format?
There are some, but it's infrequent. And it's usually more expensive and limited on LTV.
Okay. It's just not the norm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not
okay.
the norm.
Yeah. I do know of some, we'll call it South Korean lenders that have dabbled in Toronto and they provided, I think, 8 or 9% non-recourse. And then every developer in town was jumping down their throat.
Right.
I could borrow at non-recourse.
Right.
I'm like, 9%. Like, that's not cheap.
Yeah.
But I think that capital markets foundational structure, that's a big issue. I'll call that like a core pillar issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other piece is the banking sector here provides way less liquidity than in the US, mostly because the lack of what I'll call a widely bought securitization system.
Mm-hmm.
So in the US, agency financing, just like your CMHC, we have agency financing where, so if I buy a house and I get a mortgage, that gets packaged up and resold to investors as bond products.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also the case for commercial financing. So I build 1,000 units. I go to the agent, I get agency financing that gets packaged up and sold off. That market per year of new originations is 2 to 3 trillion.
Gotcha. And
just residential mortgages getting packaged up.
Right.
And resold to investors. So that allows us in the US access to deeper liquidity.
Mhm.
I recall helping a friend up here looking at refinancing his office building. And I thought, okay, there must be like decent, liquidity there. And so you go to like a big bank like TD or RBC or whatever. And they say, I'll give you 60%, like the amortization is going to be like 20 years. And so instead of a 5% interest rate, with amortization, it's really like 8.
Right.
And you're like, oh, well, that doesn't make any financial sense.
Right.
And so there's a big missing component of bank financing. I think it's just a pure liquidity issue. And then the third leg is also, I think you have the government competing here with the private sector in a lot of places, like multifamily housing, which in Canada is purpose-built rental. CMHC is literally providing all of the financing for that entire like new, quote unquote, new industry. It's not new, but just in this permutation.
Yeah.
So you have the government providing 90% of the financing.
So there's
Like,
not room.
What's a bank going to do if it's 2% and it comes from the government?
Right.
And so now you have like, these kind of wobbly issues, and you've got indigestion in the capital markets, banks that don't want to lend as much. And then you have the government competing with banks. And so,
And not exclusively on the lending side either. Like there are a bunch of these government programs where they're now actually buying real estate too, which is a unique beast in itself.
and then this was the case in the US in like post World War II. Like the government built a ton of housing, and then the government got out of that business. And
Right.
Canada similarly.